In Sudan, a war is being waged against women. In central Jazeera state, several have reportedly taken their own lives after being raped or to avoid the same fate. I'm Annalise Borges, and we begin this episode of The Stream with a heart-wrenching account sent to us from Sudan.
أنا اسمي أريج من رفاعة. نحن طبعا من ضمن الناس اللي عانينا شديد من ناس الدعم السريع. أنا من ضمن الناس اللي اتضررت بإنه دخلوا بيتنا وقالوا لي ألفاظ ما حلوة شديد وضربوني. راسي ده والله خيطته 5 غرز ويدي اتفكت، جسمي كله يتورم. طبلوا أبوي جوا الحمام وضربوا أختي برضه. وإضافة كان حصل يعني برغم إنه ضربونا ليه ده نحن ما طلعنا، فبقت في حالات بتاعة تحرش. يعني في فريقنا في واحدة حاولوا يتحرشوا بيها 3 نزلوا حقوها بالموت من الدعامة ديت جوا بيته. يلا كانوا ناس البيت طلع لما حاولت قاومتهم وكده قام شرط لها ورقة بالسكين. وغير إنه تاني في واحدة اغتصبوها قدام أبوها في البيت، يعني قدام أبوه وقدام أخوانا ناس الدعم السريع دي برضو معانا في نفس الفريق. وفي واحدة دي دي قالوا لها إذا أنت ما رقدتي لنا، بما إنه ما عندك ذهب وقروش، إذا ما رقدتي لنا يعني إحنا بنقتلك ضرب قتلونا اقتلوني. يعني جسمها من شدة ماشي وهو لا كمية مبالغ فيها بالضرب، كان بضرب فيها بالحديدة بتاعت الماسورة، ضربة بكمية مبالغ فيها.
That was Arij's testimony and the story of what happened to her, her sister, neighbors, and cousin. Like tens of thousands of women, they are trapped in a nightmare. Death, destruction, and displacement are hallmarks of any war, but the scale with which they're happening in Sudan is staggering. 14 million people have been displaced by the ongoing conflict there. More than 3 million of those have crossed borders to flee the violence. 25 million people are in desperate need of aid, and now the UN says rape is being widely used as a weapon of war. To discuss the horrific events women and girls are enduring in Sudan, we have joining us today Omnia Mustafa, an activist from Sudan's Jazeera state who has joined the millions of Sudanese who have left the country. She joins us today from Cairo. Yara Hunoud, also a displaced Sudanese, joining us from Kuala Lumpur. From Port Sudan, Leila Tomei, the International Organization for Migration Sudan Deputy Chief of Mission, and Hiba Morgan, Al Jazeera's Sudan correspondent, joining us from Omdurman. Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for being part of the stream today. Hiba, I would like to start with you, if that is okay. A UN fact-finding mission has documented widespread sexual violence against women and children in Sudan. Victims recounted being attacked in their homes, beaten, lashed, and threatened with death or harm to their relatives or children before being raped, often by more than one perpetrator. They were also subjected to sexual violence while seeking shelter from attacks or fleeing. I mean, the story here is horrific. What have you been able to corroborate about this?
Now, I just want to remind you that sexual violence and rape is not something that women here in Sudan talk about freely or comfortably. And despite that, now, with that fact that it's a stigma, that there's a stigma around it, that people feel ashamed when they talk about it, we still hear stories. So the stories that we're hearing is likely a fraction of the reality. I was in Shendi not more than a week ago. We met with people who were displaced, fleeing the RSF from Jazeera state. And a lot of them spoke about the sexual violence. They spoke about the physical abuse. They spoke about the fact that there were girls who were missing, that they didn't know their whereabouts, and they can only imagine, having seen what the RSF has done while they were still in their villages. They can imagine what the girls are going through now that they've been abducted by the RSF. So yes, these reports that we're getting from the UN, from rights groups, we've heard those stories and more horrifying stories from the women who've been displaced, not just from Jazeera state, because again, this conflict has been ongoing since April last year.
Yes.
There have been numerous reports from the UN that rape is being used as a weapon of war. So we've heard these stories here in Omdurman from people who've been displaced from areas of the RSF. We've heard it when we went to Gaddafi during the initial first wave of displacement, when people fled from Jazeera state to Gaddafi. That was in December and January. It's a story that's being repeated over and over again, different versions, different victims, but it's always the same horror. Women saying that they're being used as a weapon, that their bodies are being used as a conflict zone now, that they feel like this battle, the battle between the army and the RSF is being fought on their bodies, and they don't feel like, and rightly so, they don't think that that's how it should be. They're just trying to flee for their lives, they're trying to survive, and yet here they are being, used as one of the sides, as one of those factors in the conflict, and that's not what they want. What they're looking for is safety. What they're looking for is a chance to live, a chance to survive, and what ends up happening for many of them is that they're getting harassed and sexually assaulted.
Omnia, you are from Jazeera State. As Hiba just mentioned there, that is just one of the areas where there's been accounts of sexual violence. Can you tell us what you have heard, witnessed, or I don't know, God forbid, even experienced in that respect? Can you share with us?
Okay, so I am originally from Jazeera. My father lived his whole life in Jazeera, but I was born and raised in Khartoum. I go to Jazeera for vacations all the time. And after the war started in Khartoum in April 2023, we fled to Jazeera and we stayed there for more than 9 months until the war expanded to Jazeera. So we have been in Madani, the capital city of Jazeera, when the RSF invaded it back in December. And my father and his family refused to leave at the beginning because they were like, we already lost our homes in Khartoum. We're not going to give up our generational homes, like the houses of our fathers and grandfathers, So we weren't going to leave, but then we started to hear about the rape and the sexual violence. And my family decided that the safety of women and girls in my family is much more important than homes or anything else. This is why we fled Madani and we went to a nearby village in a Jazeera state as well, south of Jazeera. And we stayed there for more than a month and a half, and we've been continuously attacked by the RSF every single day. They come in waves. First, they loot the cars. Second, they loot money, golds. And the third wave is usually when they start asking for women. Like, I remember one night, some of them were really drunk and they were asking like for girls. So the people of the village literally gathered every single woman and locked them all in a hole. And then the men of the village slept outside, basically, all of them carrying different weapons, like to protect the women. Like a lot of people have been hearing a lot of counts of sexual violence and rape being used against women in this war. And we've been hearing news from the villages nearby that of such cases happening. So every time they came to the village, we lived in immense terror.
I guess it's important to note, and again, Hiba mentioned this before as well, but we've heard accounts and reports about rape being used as a weapon of war before in Sudan. But I guess what is so staggering this time is also the reports that go with it, talking about women taking their own lives to avoid that fate or after having experienced such violence. Yara, the UN has also highlighted that both the RSF and the Sudanese army were suspected of using sexual violence as a weapon of war. What have you heard about women's experiences and also about the fact that some of them are being sexually abused in one area, and then when that area changes hands, they are sexually abused by the other group as well? So it seems like an endless cycle of violence, that the only solution they find to that violence is indeed ending their own lives. Can you talk to us about what you've heard about that?
Definitely. The level of sexual violence that has been, done towards the women and girls of Sudan is absolutely horrific and beyond words. And as you said, it's not a one-sided thing. There are abuses on both sides, and there has to be criticism from both sides. Because this war, unfortunately, has been underreported and kind of swept under the rug, especially in the mainstream, and a lot of rogue units and also official units have resorted to sexual violence as a weapon of war. And in Sudanese culture, it's very, as Hiba Morgan said, it's very, it's a big stigma in order for women to discuss these things. And a lot of the time as well, I'd like to add to that, a lot of the time violence against women is also used as a tool of humiliating men and humiliating and then trying to create sort of a feminine image of men, like they cannot protect their women, and therefore we would use it as a weapon of war. A lot of the time, the abuse is coming from the army or from the Sudanese armed forces are towards marginalized communities, because no matter how we look at it and no matter how we try to run away from the history, the RSF is the brainchild of the Sudanese armed forces. They are connected. It's its younger brother, its right hand. They are continuing and expanding the abuses of the Sudanese armed forces in the West and now in Greater Sudan. So to completely remove them from that and to completely absolve them from that, because now they represent the government and now they have become their enemy, does not automatically absolve them from what they're currently doing and what they've done in the past. As to stories that I've heard, they're endless. They're completely endless. And unfortunately, you mentioned corroboration earlier. Due to the fact that Sudan is almost inaccessible because of blockades by both the RSF and the SAF, it's very difficult to corroborate a lot of the stories, even amongst ourselves. When we hear stories, we have no choice to believe them so that we can preserve our own lives, so we can preserve the lives of our female cousins, our aunts. We tell each other these stories to survive, and we have to believe it, and we have to take the proper precautions, whether corroborated or not. We have to rely on social media. We have to talk to each other. We have to take the maximum possible precautions so that we know how to get out of these situations. It's a survival tactic. So to mention corroboration is kind of, I won't use the word irrelevant, but we don't have time, basically. It's an emergency for us. So everything in our eyes is to believe, is to believe exactly what victims have told us, so that we may survive violence that we've experienced.
I appreciate you bringing that up. I was obviously asking Hiba about some of the challenges of the work of reporting on this story, but I do appreciate you bringing that up. Leila, I want to ask you about how you are trying to help the people that come out of Sudan, because the road to safety is a very dangerous one. In October alone, 60,000 people crossed the border into Chad. That's up from 20,000 in September. The numbers are very shocking. But obviously, once they reach these safe spaces, let's call it like that, for lack of a better word, in neighboring countries, the obstacles don't end there. What kind of help are you able to get, and what are the challenges in helping women and girls that are fleeing the Sudanese conflict?
Allow me to start by saying that this is a huge crisis. It's a huge displacement crisis. As you have mentioned, we have 11 million IDPs within Sudan. And then we have more than 3 million who have crossed into neighboring countries. The kind of horrific journeys they have to go through, whether they are being displaced within Sudan or displaced across the borders, is unimaginable. And you can imagine that these people have left everything behind. They have nothing, so they need everything. From IOM side, we help within Sudan and we help with within neighboring countries. We have teams in Chad, we have teams in Egypt, and we have teams in South Sudan and other countries as well. The kind of things things that people need, women especially, they need protection. In order to be able to provide protection, you need to provide them with everything they need, from food to shelter to clothing to education to health services. This is protection. And then you have specific protection services that they need, especially if they are survivors of rape, survivors of sexual violence. We have, in cooperation, of course, with UNHCR, because once they cross the borders, they become asylum seekers. Not by default, but they register with UNHCR. So there is a collaboration between the two agencies to be able to provide services for them. But let me draw the attention to the inside Sudan. You have 11 million people on the move. And out of these 11 million people, you have almost 80% women and children under the age of 18. They need protection. For the UN to be able to provide protection, we need to be present on the ground. We need to be able to access the areas that we cannot access right now. And we need to be able to draw the attention of the world that despite the fact that this is a protection crisis, protection is underfunded.
Hiba, you have been covering this story since the start of this particular wave of the crisis, since April last year, and you've covered a multitude of angles. It's important also to note here that this particular report, this latest UN report, also highlights that men and boys are also victims of sexual exploitation, sexual violence at times, especially in detention. I want to ask you about whether or not you've been able to cover the long-term impact that this war will have, especially on children, boys and girls. What have you heard from experts about that? And is there anything that can be done right now to mitigate the damage?
Before we come to what the experts say when it comes to the long-term impact and the psychological impact for the boys and girls, the young boys and girls, there's what the parents say. Now, we've spoken again to the parents of several children, I would say hundreds at this point, again, because this conflict has been going on for a while now. And every time you speak to a parent about, what their sons or daughters have gone through, it's always a question of, what comes next? How do I get my son, how do I get my daughter to get over this trauma that they've gone through, over this horror that they've seen, that they've witnessed, that they've lived. And what surprises me is that, it's not just, again, I've been covering Sudan even prior to this conflict. There were ethnic conflicts, and there were usually, like displacements. And every time I used to cover them, it used to be like a specific layer, a specific society, a specific group that seems to be targeted. Now, with this conflict, everyone is affected. And when you look at them, they say, I don't know how to get my son to heal. I don't know how to get my daughter to heal, because we've lost everything economically, socially, physically. They've been affected. They've been abused. They've been harassed. They've been assaulted. They've seen people being assaulted. They've seen their homes being destroyed. They've seen their homes being ransacked. So the parents are always worried about, how do I get my son or my daughter to recover from that? I've seen parents and I've seen kids who up to date have stopped talking completely, not a single word, because of the shock they're in, because of the trauma that they've gone through, and they're still trying to process it and make sense of it. This is in terms of the family. Now, when you speak to the experts, the very few experts here in Sudan who are focused on these issues, they say that they don't feel like there's a proper setup for them to be able to address the impacts, the psychological impacts, the mental impacts of this conflict. Most of the people are displaced in areas where there is no access to mental and psychosocial support. There's still people who are trapped in active conflict zones, and they keep seeing this horror every day over and over again. And in the few places where there is psychosocial support, where there's some kind of trauma healing process that they can join or be a part of, it's when you look at the number of kids being affected and the number of services, or the number of the service providers in terms of providing those kinds of care, it's just not proportionate, because it's just way too many boys and girls that have been affected over, I would say, a short period of time.
Again, the magnitude of this crisis is very impressive. We're approaching the end of the show, unfortunately, but I do want to get Omnia and Yara to tell me if you guys have a message to the world at this stage. We've seen quite a lot of mobilization towards what was happening in Sudan 20 years ago, and not so much now. Do you guys think that the international community should be doing more? Do you think that individuals should be talking about it more? I want your take and your message today. Omnia, if I can get you to go first.
I'm going to be very raw with you. I think that the world is very, very desensitized to African suffering, because if we're looking at numbers, Sudan is the biggest humanitarian crisis ongoing right now in the world. And unfortunately, it's getting not enough coverage at all. Mm-hmm. I would say that the whole world has turned their backs on us and have become very desensitized to our suffering. It's like just another day of a conflict in Africa. What am I going to do about it? Completely neglecting the fact that we are also humans and we're deserving of protection and care as much as anyone in any other place in the world that's currently experiencing the horrors we are experiencing. As for the international community, politically, there's a lot of things that could have been done and are not being done. And if we were to talk about, like, maybe it's because they benefit from this or not, it's going to be another discussion. But to keep it simple, my message is I would like people to humanize the Sudanese people. I would like people to listen. And if you're not going to help, the least I ask of you is to just bear witness to our suffering.
Very, very powerful and raw message, as you warned us. It would be. Yara, what about you? Do you have a message? What do you hope the world understands about Sudan today?
Just like Umnia said, the world has turned its back on Sudan. The most that I can ask for is for people to pay attention, for the Twitter statements to go beyond Twitter, for there to be actual meaningful change and meaningful legislation and meaningful change happening in the UN and in the greater society as a whole. Another thing I want to highlight, especially what's happening in Sudan. Right now, yes, it started as a war between two generals, but it's important to point out that this is a proxy war. This is a war that is being funded by outsider groups, namely the United Arab Emirates and other countries as well. It's important to understand that this has evolved into ethnic violence. It has evolved, or actually it started as ethnic violence and it has spread throughout Sudan. And the end goal is to destroy the very fabric of our society. And the longer that people take a back seat and continue to look from a distance, the worse it will get. Our lives do matter. Sudanese people matter just as much as any other group. And it is so important, more than just paying attention, it is so important that we actually make meaningful change and world leaders speak up for once about what is right. Because we can all see that Sudan is going a horrible way. And we need help. We need help.
We need help. Yara, Omnia, Laila, and Hiba, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for helping us understand what's going on in Sudan. And thank you all for tuning in. Keep your eyes on Sudan and use the hashtag or the handle AJStream to send us your questions and suggestions for the show. Take care, and I'll see you soon.